Risk management means exactly what it says. It refers to the steps you take to manage the potential risks associated with your project. As you know, things don't always go as planned. You can't predict what will happen or exactly what challenges or constraints will arise. Planning for risks won't eliminate them, but it will help you plan how to respond. Some risks can be considered negative risks or threats, events that have the potential to negatively impact your project's objectives or deliverables. And some risks can be considered positive risks or opportunities. In this lecture, I'm going to focus on the negative risks or threats to your project. Let's first consider a simple framework to help us think about potential risks and how to handle them. On the project level, here are some questions to consider. What? What can get in the way? What obstacles might come up? What could go wrong? What might prevent or delay the achievement of the project's objectives or deliverables? It's often helpful to review your task list when identifying risks. It's also useful to involve your team in this process, as different people might anticipate different problems or envision different solutions. How? How will these issues impact the achievement of project objectives? How could we address each of these issues? This is risk assessment and response. When? When in the project cycle might you expect these risks would occur? How likely are they to actually happen? When considering each risk, you can also consider two other questions that are essential for risk management. One, what are your absolute priorities? And two, where might compromise be possible? If the completely unexpected happens, these are two questions that can help you figure out which aspects of the work are critical for achieving results and which you might be able to let go of and still get the results you need. Referring back to your project's goals and objectives is a good place to start when considering priorities. This is a basic and simple approach to risk management. In your project plan, you can include the risks you've identified, as well as how you will assess and respond to them. Another more complex framework that is commonly used in risk management is called enterprise risk management, or ERM. ERM assesses risk and opportunity in the context of strategic objectives and views risk holistically, not functionally. It uses categories of risk, including compliance, operations, financial, strategic, and mega. Compliance risk is a risk created by failing to follow national or local laws and regulations or organizational policies. Operations risk is a risk that may affect ongoing day-to-day management processes, for example, customer service, supply chain, people, or information technology. Financial risk is a risk that may result in loss of assets or financial resources. Strategic risk is a risk that may affect an organization's ability to achieve its goals or objectives. These are often identified as part of strategic planning. Mega refers to a large-scale external risk or mega trends that can impact human health, the business sector, the environment, or a society. Mega risks are generally too large or too complex to be managed by a single entity, and are typically addressed by monitoring their impact on strategic objectives. Examples of mega risks would be an Ebola outbreak or a natural disaster such as an earthquake. ERM uses 8 process steps to identify and manage risks. We won't discuss all of them in detail during this course, but there's a resource on it for further reading if you're interested in ERM. We will discuss some of these steps, including risk identification, risk assessment, risk response, and controls. Let's start with risk identification. As discussed, a good place to start to look for risk is in your list of activities or tasks. Some other places to look to help you identify risks include contracts, past audits, survey results, financial statements, old project reports, specifically in the lessons learned section. You identify a risk by writing it in a risk statement. It is important to clearly present the risk information. According to Dorothea Brand, a problem clearly stated is a problem half solved. Here are some tips for writing risk statements based on ERM. Name the actual compliance violation, financial loss, or harm we want to avoid. Example, pollution or air quality, dust contamination during construction or renovation. Use plain language to describe the risk rather than citing a rule or a regulation. For example, risk is the harm or the consequence from not complying with the rule. Pollution, contaminated soils or properties, spills that contaminate soil or water to the extent that cleanup action is required. Be specific enough to assess internal controls. For example, pollution, such as chemical use. Chemicals stored or managed improperly result in accidental release. Distinguish a risk from a breakdown in control. For example, untrained staff or not keeping records are control failures, not risks themselves, unless the internal controls are mandatory. For example, failure to provide required asbestos training is itself a compliance violation. Avoid including a solution in your risk statement. Develop the solution after the risk is identified and assessed. Avoid blaming anyone or any particular policy. The next step of ERM is risk assessment. The purpose of this step is to rank or prioritize risks and inform decisions about whether risks need to be avoided, mitigated, or accepted. When possible, use quantitative data to estimate likelihood and impact. So you estimate likelihood by using a scale from 1 to 5, where 1 is equal to rare and 5 is almost certain. You estimate impact by using a scale from 1 to 5, where 1 is insignificant and 5 is catastrophic. And you multiply likelihood and impact to produce a risk score. In this table, you see the sample risk named doors not locked by staff. I ranked it a 2 in terms of likelihood, indicating it is unlikely to happen. In terms of impact, I ranked it a 3, meaning it is right in the middle, potential for serious impact. I multiplied the likelihood and impact to produce a level of risk score, which in this case is 6. This next table shows the total scores for each combination of likelihood and impact. Remember that likelihood and impact are multiplied to produce a level of risk. For example, if a risk scores a 1 in likelihood and a 5 in impact, the risk score is 5. If a risk scores a 5 in likelihood and a 4 in impact, the risk score is 20. To interpret what these risk scores mean, you can use this chart that lists the risk levels from extreme to low and are color-coded based on risk scores. A risk score between 19.5 and 25 is extreme, while a risk score between 1 and 4.4 is low. These risk levels correspond to ERM's risk response table, which we will discuss shortly. You can also use these numbers to plot your risks on a risk map. We won't discuss the details of risk maps, but you can read more about it in the ERM resource. The next step is risk response. Risk response refers to the broad category of actions to prevent a loss from occurring, as well as respond to ones that occur. For extreme and high risks, you can avoid the risk by discontinuing the activity or making it impossible for the risk to occur. For substantial risks, you can mitigate the risk by reducing the likelihood, loss prevention, or the impact, loss reduction. You can also transfer or share the risk to someone who is able to manage the risk or take responsibility for it. This is generally through insurance or a contract. Finally, for medium and low risks, you can accept the risk by taking no active measures to deal with the threat other than including it in the baseline and monitoring its status over time. If the risk comes to fruition, you respond to it accordingly. The last ERM step that we'll discuss is controls. You can use controls to manage your risk and to mitigate it. Common risk controls include policies and procedures, education and awareness, operational controls such as documentation, physical controls such as door locks, and administrative controls such as segregation of duties. As a project manager, being able to manage risk is an essential skill. You will have to make decisions that could have a large impact on the results of your project. Risk management is not a one-time event. It is a continuous process throughout the project. You should strive to eliminate potential risk factors that will have an impact on your ability to achieve your project's objectives as soon as possible. For example, let's say that the Ministry of Health, one of your key stakeholders, has not signed off on your project's approach. Instead of just noting that this lack of approval can impact the overall community buy-in of your project, figure out a way to get that stakeholder to sign off in a more timely manner. In my experience, the two most common project-level risks are related to human resources and timelines. There are so many things that can delay timelines, both internal and external factors. It is also sometimes wise to be mindful of how you are communicating risks to project staff. You want to be transparent, but at the same time, you want to be cautious about causing unnecessary panic. For example, too much information related to funding uncertainty can make staff nervous and may lead to unnecessary turnover. You should communicate to staff if the funding issues are serious and you believe they are likely to happen. To summarize, in this lecture, we talked about risk management and discussed the enterprise risk management method for addressing it.